Hello everyone, Professor Cornish here. Welcome to part 3 of our presentation on evidence-based practices using what works in corrections. Now in part 1, we discussed what evidence-based practices are, as well as what qualities make programs ineffective, what qualities make them effective. Now part 2, we discussed two of the concepts of evidence-based practices: assessing actuarial needs, which is using assessments to determine risk factors and protective factors, as well as needs of the offender. And then the principle of targeting interventions, which is using the results of those assessments to determine appropriate programs for that offender based upon the need, risk, responsivity, and dosage principles. And now we're going to go into the remaining principles of evidence-based practices in the correctional field. Now, the first principle we're going to discuss is enhancing intrinsic motivation. Now, that refers to the offender's motivation to change. So changing their behavior and actions, really their willingness to change from someone that was criminalistic, antisocial, unconventional, to someone that is pro-social, conventional, law-abiding. Now, this motivation to change, some offenders have it right away. Others, it can take a while, sometimes months or even years. Some never become motivated to change. But this principle is addressing that motivation to change and trying to actually motivate that offender to rehabilitate. Now, enhancing intrinsic motivation, it recognizes that motivation, it is dynamic. It doesn't always stay the same. You know, I supervised inmates during my correctional career, starting from like the age of when they were 18. Some of them didn't want to rehabilitate, they didn't care. But then as time progressed, they became older, they matured, their brain fully developed, then they were ready to. And even that readiness can go up and down, depending on various things. And this motivation to change, it can be influenced by personal interactions. Now, evidence-based practice advocates use motivational interviewing techniques to initiate and maintain offender behavioral changes. Now, motivational interviewing, it is an evidence-based practice. And it is partially centered on learning theories. But motivational interviewing, it's person-centered, direct method for enhancing intrinsic motivation to change. And it draws upon the stages of change by exploring and resolving ambivalence. So those of you who end up going into case management in the criminal justice field, you most likely will be trained in motivational interviewing. Also, depending on the department, those of you that are not in case management may be trained in motivational interviewing. And then obviously the related fields such as mental health, substance use, child protection, other social services, education. Many of you may be trained in motivational interviewing as well. It's not just focused on offenders. Now, here's an illustration of the change stages of change. You have the pre-contemplation phase, where basically the person has no intention of changing. They don't want to, they see no point in it, they may not feel that they need to change. And then you have the contemplation stage, which really they're not committed to changing, you know, taking the action yet, but they're like, maybe I do need to. maybe I don't deal with my anger well, or whatever the issue is. They're starting to think about it. Then you have the preparation phase where they're actually now starting to take the action. Like, okay, yeah, I do see I have an issue with my anger. I'm in this anger management course. Maybe I actually need to be paying better attention in this course and actually working with my probation officer on really learning this program and starting to use it. So they're starting to take the steps. They're starting to prepare to actually do it. So really with preparation, they're starting to get a game plan. Yes, I need to change. And you know what? I'm thinking maybe these are the steps that I need to take. Then you have the action phase where basically they want to change and they're taking the steps to. So like with the anger management class, they're actively participating, they're engaging in the role-playing sessions, they're really paying attention in class, they're doing the homework that gets prescribed to them, and they're actually starting to use the techniques in their real life. Then you have the maintenance phase, which now that they recognize they need to change and they're taking those action steps to change, now they're maintaining it. And then you have relapse, where basically it's kind of the person falls off the wagon. So like maybe they ended up getting into a major argument with their significant other and law enforcement got called. With a relapse situation, you can come in and actually talk to them about, why they had this issue, why they relapsed, help remind them of the progress they've made. And okay, in this situation, what did you do that was wrong? What could you have done that would have been better? So how can we get you back on track? Now, these stages don't occur like 1, 2, 3, 4. They can change progression. Like you might go from the pre-contemplation phase straight to the action phase. Or you might be in the maintenance phase and relapse, and then you're back to the contemplation phase. So it's not a static progression. It can bounce back and forth. Now, ambivalence is what with this motivational interviewing we're addressing. And it's different from resistance. Now, ambivalence is the coexistence of opposing attitudes and beliefs and uncertainty or indecisiveness about the course of action to follow. Now, you can have resistance with this. And some of you that go into case management, you'll find someone that's ambivalent and resistant. So you'll end up having to sort through both. Now, by focusing on ambivalence, motivational interviewing, the acronym for it's MI. So if you ever hear the term MI, motivational interviewing. But motivational interviewing increases the chances an offender, in the case of the criminal justice field, will experience long-lasting change. So this is how you motivate them. And MI is evidence-based. And like I said, those of you that go into case management in the criminal justice and even a multitude of other fields, or even not case management in those fields, you'll most likely get training on motivational interviewing. Now, the second portion of enhancing intrinsic motivation really is your working relationship with the offender. So the working relationship between the program delivery staff, like facility case management staff, probation and parole officers, educational staff, mental health, substance abuse staff, etc., and the offender or the patient, the client, whatever, student, whatever term, depending on the field. Now, 30% of client improvement is linked to the helping relationship between the staff and the offender. That's why that professional relationship is so important. Now, staff, they need to balance their enforcement in intervention role. You know, basically your cop role versus your helper role. You need to find a balance, that middle ground. Clarify your role with the offender, because it's important that they have set boundaries with the relationship. That they know you're going to help them, but you're going to hold them accountable when they mess up. You're not going to let them get away with anything. You know, they need to know the boundaries of that relationship and what that relationship is supposed to look like. Also, the staff model pro-social behavior. You know, they model what they want the offender, how they want the behavior to think and behave. They show empathy without diminishing accountability. Because we still want to hold the offender accountable for their wrongdoings. But we do need to have an understanding about where they're coming from and some of the things that attributed to the circumstances they're in. And also, you need to focus interactions on problem solving and addressing criminogenic needs. You know, those dynamic risk factors that can change. Now, evidence-based practices requires staff to relate to the offender on an interpersonal, sensitive, and constructive manner while maintaining professional distance and avoiding overfamiliarity. In more of your helper roles, like case management, mental health, substance use, education, vocation, etc., sometimes it's really easy to kind of go beyond the bounds of that professional relationship, you know, that staff-client relationship, to a friendship. And you want to make sure that you avoid that. You know, you treat the offender as a person, but you recognize you're not their buddy. So any of you that are going into the criminal justice field, it's important that you remember that you have to have that professional distance. And also the other fields too, you know, other related fields. You need to make sure that you're maintaining that professional relationship. Like if you're working in a school, for example, you know, yeah, you want to have a personal relationship with your students, but you need to make sure it's professional and that you're not your student's buddy. The next concept of evidence-based practices, and this is another concept that has a strong theoretical foundation, is skill building with directed practice. This is where your learning theories come in. Now, skill building with directed practice, it is an application of general responsivity, which responsivity is the individualization of programming. You have specific, which is really targeting it towards the individual, and then general responsivity is really how you're delivering the program. Now, skill building with directed practice, you're actually utilizing cognitive behavioral techniques. So those of you that, for mental health and substance use, you're going to be using cognitive behavioral therapy, which is clinical. Those of you non-clinical case management, like caseworkers, case managers, probation, parole officers, diversion officers, pretrial services officers, etc., you'll be using cognitive behavioral skill training, which is non-clinical. Now, cognitive behavioral techniques are encompassed by two things, cognitive and behavioral. Now, cognitive focuses on the cognitions, really the thoughts. So the expectations, the attitudes, the beliefs that lead to distress. And these can be modified to relieve distress and promote adaptive behavior. So you're looking at the thought processes, like if you have an offender that has major anger issues, you're looking at situations where they're becoming angry. What are they thinking when they become angry? And then you're looking at behavioral, which behavioral therapy or behavioral techniques are also known as behavior modification because you're modifying that behavior. And it's a systematic application of principles of learning to direct the modification of an individual's problematic behaviors. So with cognitive, you're looking at the thoughts, the attitudes, the expectations. Behavioral, we're looking at what happens as a result of those, the behavior. So again, the person who gets angry, you're going to be looking at situations that make them angry, what they're thinking, and then how do they respond to that anger. And then with how they respond, what are the problems that come about because of that anger? One of which could be, you know, you assaulted someone, you ended up getting arrested. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive skill techniques focus on the logic behind the behavior, the attitudes, the values, and beliefs that reinforce or inhibit certain behaviors. Now, in cognitive behavioral techniques, whether it's clinical or non-clinical, when you're working with the offender in whatever program, and there's a lot of cognitive behavioral based programs, the majority of the programs in the criminal justice field, especially the correctional ones that focus on intervention, rehabilitation, reintegration, they are very learning based. And a big facet of these is role playing and modeling. So basically, with cognitive behavioral techniques, you're giving the offender the opportunity to actually, you know, once they've analyzed their thoughts, their attitudes, their beliefs, and how those translates into behaviors and why they cause problems, then you're working with them on, okay, let's say when you do get angry, what are some things you could do so you're dealing with that anger in a more appropriate manner? And you do a lot of role playing with that in a safe environment. So the offender, they're given the opportunity to learn, and then you give them feedback, both good and bad, because they need to know when they're doing a good job, just like they need to know when they're not doing a good job. And if there is a deficiency, okay, here's what it is and why, and here's what you should have done and why. No, let's go ahead and practice again. And then you're actually, as a staff, you're modeling that behavior. Now, cognitive behavioral based programs can reduce recidivism, research has shown, by 25%. And that reduction, depending on the program, can vary between 25 to 57%. So cognitive based techniques are huge. And I will state that they don't happen overnight, because most unconventional antisocial criminal behavior is learned over time. So unlearning those behaviors and learning ones that are pro-social, law-abiding, appropriate, it takes time. That's why your more intensive programs last from 3 months to 9 months, approximately. It's because it takes time to learn, to unlearn and learn. And now we're going to go into the next facet of evidence-based practices, which is engaging ongoing support in natural communities. Now, this principle is big because the majority of individuals are punished in the community. You know, in the criminal justice field, obviously the correctional system is the largest part of the criminal justice system. The largest part of the correctional system is community-based corrections. And that's because the majority of punishments, of interventions, are occurred at the community level. And even individuals that are incarcerated or put in detention, the majority of them will one day get out. So that's why this principle is pretty big. Now, this principle, and again, just so you name, engaging ongoing support in national communities. Engaging in ongoing support advocates for the utilization of significant individuals to the offender. Now, that's pro-social, meaning law-abiding, acting appropriately, family, and peers. And also, you're going to want to involve community groups and organizations like community support groups, faith-based organizations, service providers, etc. So really, you're getting that support system for the offender. Now, this is important, especially for inmates that have been incarcerated for a long period of time. The longer someone's incarcerated, the more likely they will lose their natural support system, their family and friends. So you may end up having to help them develop a brand new one. Now, the reason why these significant individuals, family, friends, the community groups, these organizations are important is they're going to help positively reinforce new desired behaviors while the inmates incarcerated, but also when they return back to the community, and then also offenders who are receiving their punishment in the community. And hopefully, once the individual is done with their sentence, they're off of supervision, they're out of the program, this is going to continue. Now, with this principle, you have learning theories come into play, as well as control theories. Social bonding theory is huge in this. Because if someone's behaving appropriately, they're going to positively reinforce that. You know, hey, way to go, bravo. And if they're not, they're going to hold them accountable. Hey, why'd you do that? You know, you could have gotten in trouble. This is what you needed to do instead. And also, it gives them people that they don't want to disappoint. So really, with this principle, you're developing protective factors. You're strengthening existing ones by keeping the bonds that they already have with conventional pro-social individuals and institutions, and you're developing new ones. This is part of the reason why, like in correctional facilities, they have visiting, is to keep those bonds because they are a protective factor. Now, engaging in ongoing support also means maintaining the continuity of services when the offender returns to the community. So whether it's like, let's say they're in an anger management program when they're incarcerated. You want to find a similar anger, you as the caseworker helping this inmate prepare for release, whether it's parole or they're getting out on good time or they're jamming out, which is reaching the maximum end of their sentence. You want to work with the parole officer in the area where they're going to find an anger management program that is as similar as possible to the one they're currently in. The same for mental health treatment, substance use treatment, any medical treatment they have. You want to make sure it's the same level, intensity, and frequency. So that way, really, they're not getting too big of a bump when they get out. It's going to help kind of streamline things a bit. Now, the next principle of evidence-based practices, and we talked about this when we talked about the elements of evidence-based practices, what makes an effective program, we talked about continuous assessments, both at the individual and the program level. This is that principle. This principle involves the accurate, detailed documentation of the offender's case information, along with formal and valid mechanisms to measure outcomes. Regular assessments need to be conducted of the offender's cognitive and skill development. Now, as I've talked about previously in part 1 and part 2, assessments are huge. Your initial assessments, you're going to get a baseline of the offender, where they are now. And then your ones after that, you're going to be able to see change. Now, exactly when those next sets of assessments are conducted, it's going to depend upon the department. Guaranteed they will be done when, like, let's say an inmate, for example, when they become parole eligible or they're starting to get close to their mandatory release date. But it can happen before that as well. And then also you're going to do an assessment on the program's effect on recidivism, both for the individual as well as collectively. Now, agencies need to assess the baseline. That's why these initial assessments are majorly vital, because that gives you the baseline, and then your assessments after, you're going to be able to see progress, and that gives you quantifiable data that you can look at, you can hold, real data. Now, the assessments allow the department to see the effect the program has on offender risk and recidivism. And also it allows for adjustment if needed. So like if you're using a program and it's like, you know what, our like moderate risk offenders, we're not having a lot of luck with this program with them, but a higher risk we are. So maybe we need to just leave this program for our higher risk offenders, and maybe let's start looking at something else for our moderate ones. Or maybe our moderate ones, maybe we need to tweak this program a little bit for it to be better for them. Now, assessments also need to be conducted of the staff delivering the program. Now, those assessments will determine if the staff is delivering the program as they're supposed to, as it's designed. And also, it gives the opportunity to identify any discrepancies or fidelity issues. So you're able to basically look at the staff. What are they doing that's good? What are they doing that's not so good? And get those addressed. Now, the next principle of evidence-based practice is increasing positive reinforcement and providing measurement feedback. So this principle, basically we're taking enhancing intrinsic motivation and your skill building with directed practice, and we're smushing. Now, this positive reinforcement and providing measurement feedback, it's first given to the offender regarding their progress in the program. So like, again, that offender that's taking that anger management course, when you're going through the role playing with them and you're reviewing skills, you're going to get feedback, both positive, what they're doing good, and not so positive, what they're doing wrong. But with the feedback on what their weaknesses are, what they need to do better, you're explaining, okay, this is what you did wrong, and here's why it's wrong. And here's what you should have done and why. Now let's practice that. And basically, it's helping them be able to make the changes they need to rehabilitate, as well as you're gauging their progress. Now, in prisons, when an offender does become parole eligible and they're starting to have, parole hearings, one thing that case management staff will do is they're going to be looking at the inmate's progress. The same thing with probation, parole, other types of supervision. So they're not only going to be looking at assessments, the initial and then the ongoing ones, but then also they're going to be looking at how the offender is progressing in the program. So if you're not the one that's delivering the program, you're going to be getting feedback from other people. How are they doing? And not just for programs, but also how are they doing at school? How are they doing at work? How are they in the unit? Now, this feedback regarding the offender's progress, it builds first accountability. So if they do have some issues, you're holding them accountable. You're explaining to them what they did. But then also, here's what you should have done. And if there's something positive, you're pointing that out. Like, let's say you've got that same offender with the anger management issues. Let's say it's an inmate. Goes to his unit, gets into an argument with another inmate. And after a little while in the argument, the inmate goes, you know what, man? I don't want to argue with you because I don't want to get in trouble. And the inmate walks away. Yes, you as a staff, you're gonna hold them accountable for that argument. You know, hey, you shouldn't have gotten in the argument in the first place, but then it's, hey, you recognize that that argument was wrong and it was going to lead to nowhere, but probably get you into trouble. You recognize that and you walked away and you got yourself calmed down. Good job. But also with the feedback, that's helping keep them motivated to change. So that's going to get through, hopefully, that ambivalence, that resistance. Whether you have an offender that, you know, they're in the contemplation stage, preparation stage, or in the action stage. Maybe they had a relapse. You're giving that feedback. And it also lowers the treatment attrition, you know, them kind of like failing out of the program. And it helps improve outcomes. Now, granted, this doesn't work on everybody, but it does help. Now, the feedback also needs to be given to program delivery staff regarding their performance and identifying any deficiencies. So, hey, this is what you're doing that's good. Here's what's not so good. Let's talk about how we can improve this. And also, the feedback needs to be given about the program's outcomes and other issues to both internal and external stakeholders. And that's essential because these programs, they take funding. So a department, if they're not getting feedback on how a program's doing, they may not fund it anymore. So they want to know, how's this program doing? Are we getting the outcomes that we want? And then external stakeholders like the legislature, the executive branch, they're going to want to know how this program's doing too. Because if not, we're not going to give you funding. You know, funding makes the world go round. And unfortunately, in the criminal justice field, funding gets cut to programming quite a bit. So with the feedback, the stakeholders, you're basically kind of fighting for your program to keep funding. Now, some of you might be wondering, with evidence-based practice, why the heck bother? Why should we use these? Now, utilizing evidence-based programs can reduce recidivism by 30%. And if you take into account all the facets of evidence-based practices, that can be a lot more depending. You know, there's a lot that goes into reducing the risk of reoffense. Now, if you look at recidivism rates, now the state of Wyoming, their Department of Corrections started using evidence-based practices. They started going towards it around 2002. They've been actively using evidence-based practices. Their recidivism rate is around 25%, which is one of the lowest in the nation. Now, Nebraska, they started to go towards evidence-based practices with their Department of Correctional Services in 2013, but they've had some issues. Theirs is a little more than 32%. So that's a big difference. That's nearly a 10% difference. Now, in 2012, the average national recidivism rate was 43%. Now, granted, that's different now. Now, evidence-based practices, because you have all of this research, all of these assessments, they're cost effective and they're an efficient, available use of resources. We know how they work, we know why they work. And if you have an evidence-based program, there is a ton of research on it. what theories it's based on, how to implement it, how to deliver it, what the target population is, its effectiveness. I mean, there's a ton of research that you can literally, it doesn't take a lot to start a program. You just got to make sure you're doing it right. So this keeps you from really having to develop a brand new program. And even if you do develop a new program, you can look at the different elements of different programs and make sure, okay, yeah, this is a new program. We're not evidence-based because we don't have the research to back it up yet, but we're using this program, this program, this program. We should be okay. And then, of course, as that new program's been used longer, then there'll be research on that program. So then you'll be able to, over time, hey, this new program, it is doing what it's supposed to, or, you know, it's not, maybe we need to go to something else, or maybe we need to tweak this. Now, by using already proven practices, as I said, you don't have to go through that trial and error of developing a program that's going to do what you want it to. And even if you do develop a new program, you've got so much research on existing programs that you're not, even with a new program, you're not starting at ground zero. And the thing is, utilizing ineffective programs, improperly implementing and delivering effective programs, it is a waste of money. You know, if you're going to take the time and effort to deliver a program, you want to make sure that you implemented it effectively, you delivered it effectively, your staff are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that this program is effective. Because if it's not, you just wasted all this money. And you're going to have the executive branch, the legislative branch, the public is going to be pretty upset. You know, in this current economic climate, it's important to know that we're using taxpayer money effectively and that we're getting the outcomes we want. So that's one of the big arguments with evidence-based practices is, hey, there's all this research on this. We know how it works. We know why it works. We know its outcome. We know it's effective. So if it comes down to, well, we don't have a lot of money in the budget, you can make those arguments and keep your funding, hopefully. Because that's what a lot of departments, when they are taking funding hits and they're facing programs losing funding, which is going to affect recidivism, they'll make that argument that, hey, we've got these programs that are doing good. You know, yeah, our effectiveness rate isn't 100%, but you're not going to get that. Now, the reason why with evidence-based programming, no one program is 100% effective, even if everything is being done exactly the way it's supposed to, and it's got a strong theoretical foundation. It's the individual element, the human element, the offender. Again, the saying, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can't force rehabilitation. That's why no one program is going to be 100% effective, is because you have the individual and all the circumstances with that individual. Now, research has shown that the public does currently favor a balanced approach in the correctional system. They want punishment, but they also want rehabilitation. Now, that's different from, like with Get Tough on Crime and the war on drugs, it was punish, 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 punish. Don't be soft on these guys. Well, public sentiment over time, and part of this is because of the research that's been done in evidence-based practices. The public has realized that, okay, just punishing isn't effective. You know, we're going to pretty much release the same person that got incarcerated, the same person that got in on whatever supervision. and the person could be worse. So the public's realized rehabilitation is key for societal protection. Now, the public and politicians, they want interventions that are effective in reducing recidivism. Now, the public and policymakers' perceptions, they can be changed, as I've said earlier, by explaining that the program will increase public safety by reducing the risk of reoffense while being cost effective. Now, if you have an offender that rehabilitates and they get off probation, parole, or whatever, get out of prison, if they do rehabilitate, you're not going to have them committing new crimes. You're not going to have a new trial and them getting incarcerated again or whatever. So those are the arguments that are made in regards to cost effectiveness. Would you rather pay this much for this program, or would you rather have someone committing new crimes and all the stuff with the trial and then them getting punished again? Now, I hope all of you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to contact me. And also, if there's anything else you would like me to do a presentation on, please let me know. Now, I hope with all three parts of this presentation, evidence-based practices in the correctional field, and which I said in previous presentations, a lot of this can be applied to other programs in the correctional field. Well, in the criminal justice field. But I hope with these three parts, you do have a greater understanding of evidence-based practices and what they do and why they're important. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you have a good rest of your day and stay safe out there.